Welcome back. This is Module 1, Lecture 3. We're going to be talking about sociological research. Research and theory and sociology go hand in hand. So while we can certainly think about the reasons that human beings act the way they do, what separates sociology, as we learned in the earlier module, from many other disciplines like philosophy, religion, is that sociology is backed up with facts and research. So one needs to go hand in hand with the other. If using the Henslin text in the first chapter, there is a common sense quiz which you can take, and we often see that the things that we think we know, the things that we take for granted because of the ways we were raised, we'll talk about this in future modules, but our culture and the ways that we were brought up tells us about various beliefs and values that we hold, and we think we know the way the world works, and that is what we often sometimes refer to as common sense. So in other words, we think we have a firm grasp on the way things are, we have a very firm belief in the reasons that people act the way they do, and the reasons that various phenomena occur, and if we were to just act on those beliefs without backing them up in some way with fact, that is not sociology. So I encourage everyone to take a look at the common sense quiz that is in the Henslin text. I'll give you one quick example from that if you're taking a look at it. One of the questions is, most people believe that rapists are mentally ill. And I think if you went around with a clipboard, checking with family and friends, or doing an informal poll out on the streets, you would probably find that a lot of people in our society do in fact feel that way. That in order for somebody to commit a crime of that nature, of that incredibly personal and damaging nature, that person must in some way be mentally ill. There's got to be something wrong with that person that makes them behave in that way. And again, we call that common sense. Clearly, sociologists have studied that, and we're going to be talking about that a little more in detail in just a couple of minutes. But when we talk about that idea, are rapists mentally ill, one of the things we can do is then actually put that to research. And one of the things that, if you are taking that quiz, if you turn the page and look at the answers, it will say that many sociologists have studied the behavior of people who have committed violent sexual acts, and they compare the profiles, the psychological profiles of those inmates as compared to other inmates in incarcerated or institutional situations, and they found that there's really no difference at all. The conclusion that most sociologists have arrived at in relation to that specific topic is that sexual violence is a learned behavior. It is something that people, to a certain degree, choose to do. Okay? So again, there's a good example of how some of our common sense might tell us one thing, and research refutes that and tells us something different. Okay? So we're going to take a look at how you go about conducting sociological research. I have the steps listed here behind me. And what we're going to do is take a look at these various steps, and then as soon as we run through these, we'll actually use a concrete, realistic example to outline these different types. Okay? So first thing we would do is, as we see up here, is select a topic. Okay? So we have to know exactly what it is you're researching. That topic obviously can be very broad. I'll give you an example of that in just a couple minutes. But knowing exactly what it is that you're studying clearly is a good place to start. We want to define the problem. Again, what is the issue that we're studying, and why does it have an effect on society? Okay? There's a bunch of different ways of stating that. Number 3, we want to review the literature. It's very important to acknowledge and realize that you are probably not the first person who has ever thought of this topic, that you are not the person who came up with this idea or the first person to research this. You should have a very good idea about what it is that other people have done in this field. So you would go obviously to a database, search sociological journals, you would look for scholarly articles to determine what else has already been done in the field. So by reviewing those, you'll find out what other people have thought. That doesn't necessarily mean that you will agree with what other people's research has been, or that will necessarily influence some of your thoughts about doing it. But being familiar with other people's research will make you much more in tune with exactly what it is you're trying to research. Number 4, we're going to formulate a hypothesis. Okay, a hypothesis is a statement of what you expect to learn or find from your research. Some people use the term educated guess. So by stating a hypothesis, you are saying, this is what I'm studying, these are the variables, and we'll go into some more detail about that in just a minute, that I'll be using, and this is what I expect to find. Okay, that, again, does not necessarily mean that it's what your research is going to demonstrate, but from the get-go, you plainly state, this is what I expect to see as a result of the research that I'm doing. The next step, number 5, choose a research method. I'll go into a slightly longer list of those in just a minute, but there are many, many different ways of conducting research. So for your purposes, you should choose one or more ways of conducting the research, and making sure that the methods that you've chosen are the best suited to your outcome. Number 6, we are going to collect our data. This actually means run the experiment. So that can take a lot of time, obviously. Some research runs for years, but basically what you're doing during this time is running the experiment in the parameters that you've outlined clearly in your hypothesis. You basically want to be able to talk about and demonstrate that your study has a high level of validity. In other words, that you are following the steps and procedures that you've outlined, and also that your research has a high level of reliability. In other words, that other people doing your research would be able to get similar results. So you're clearly outlining how your data is being collected. We'll go into more detail about those 2 points at the very end of this lecture. The very last, or the second to last, is we want to analyze our results. In other words, sometimes this is called number crunching. This is when we take all the data that we've used, and there's lots and lots and lots of various ways of analyzing the data. In a much higher level class, we would talk about those methods. For right now, in an introduction class, is just enough to know that there are lots of different ways of quote-unquote crunching the numbers, and that by doing so, you are now testing your hypothesis. You are going to determine whether or not the research that you did backs up or potentially refutes your hypothesis. And the last step is to share your results. Okay? And the example I'll give you in just a couple minutes, we can clearly see, even when your results might not be what you think they're going to be, that does not necessarily invalidate the idea of sharing your results. You may come up with a result that you didn't expect. You may absolutely find out that your hypothesis is not in any way supported. That does not necessarily mean that you would not be able to share your results. Your results may be very useful to another researcher, or may just basically, again, the challenge to your hypothesis may be valuable in itself. But when we talk about ethics, we'll see that sociological research absolutely should never be done in a manner which would be considered secretive or closed off. It's always done in an open, public manner, so sharing your results is a very important aspect of the process. All right, let's go back to methods real quick. What I want to talk about here is the idea of, once again, there are many, many different types of ways of doing research. I'm going to run through some of them just briefly right now. Probably one of the ones that we're most familiar with is the idea of conducting a survey. Okay, a survey is basically some list of questions that we would present to a group of people to ask them their opinions, their attitudes, their ideas about specific topics. Okay, So the population that we're studying is basically the target group, people that we're going to ask to participate in our survey. Basically, some of the most important things about conducting surveys is that we conduct them from the position of a neutral standpoint. We're not trying to ask leading questions of people. We're not trying to get people to agree with anything. We're giving them a completely unbiased opportunity to state exactly what it is that they feel about certain topics. Establishing rapport with people is sometimes very important when conducting surveys, making sure that they fully understand exactly what it is that the survey is about, the research is about, that they trust that you are a qualified person and a trustworthy person to be giving this type of survey, and that they know that the questions that are being asked are going to be used for the purposes of research. So again, there's many different ways of taking surveys. I'm sure many of you have taken surveys, whether or not it's been that kind of informal. People stop you in places like the mall or in public just to ask you your opinions about things. Whether or not you've taken online surveys. SurveyMonkey is a very popular online tool. It's often used. Consumer surveys are used all the time, where you've probably seen them in commercials. Blind taste test. Taste cola A, taste cola B. Which one do you prefer? Clearly, we tend to think about those types of research as sometimes being rather invalid. We're sure that they're not showing us all the people who prefer the other brand, as it were, but it gives you that idea about exactly how a survey is conducted. Another type of method for conducting sociological research is what we call participant observation, sometimes also called field work. It's that idea of you want to understand how people behave and act. Go out in public and watch them and observe what they do. We can sometimes talk about this in terms of, if you think about anthropology, going to live among a group of people to study their society, even in things like biology or physical anthropology, primatology, very famous, people like Jane Goodall, who go and live among apes and primates, chimpanzees, to study how they behave. Again, we don't refer to that necessarily in terms of sociological terms, but you get the idea. Participant observation, a sociologist doing field work, is going out and experiencing exactly what it is that the subjects or the sample of the people that he's studying, exactly he or she, are experiencing. One of my most famous examples, or my favorite examples of all time, a young graduate student at the University of Chicago in, I believe, the late 1970s, early 80s, by the name of Elijah Anderson, had some theories based on something we'll talk about in a future module, about the idea of how society is divided up into layers. And one of his thoughts was, we tend to group them into very large layers, upper, middle, lower, those kind of things. And even when we talk about the lower classes, we tend to look at that as one kind of non-diverse group. Like, in other words, lower classes, all poor people, kind of react the same, act the same. And his theory was that even among the lowest members of society, there's still stratification, that people will attempt to put themselves into layers depending on self-defined criteria. So how would he go about studying that? Well, what now Dr. Anderson did was to spend about 3 years hanging out in a bar in South Chicago. Hung out at a little place called Jelly's. It was a corner bar in, like I said, the south side of Chicago, and the name of his book that eventually came from his thesis was called A Place on the Corner. So he didn't walk in with a clipboard and announce to everybody he was a sociologist doing research. He walked in street clothing and blended in, basically, for a couple of years and just watched the participants. So clearly, it's a little different than a survey in the sense that you're not making it clear to people that you are engaging in sociological research, and as a matter of fact, you can kind of call this undercover work. For Anderson, clearly one of his concerns would have been that if these largely gentlemen who hung out at this bar knew that he was a student, that they might act in a way that they wouldn't normally act, and they might influence their behavior, or his presence might influence their behavior and give him non-valid or non-biased outcomes. So when we do participant observation, we're actually interacting with human beings in a way that, again, is something observable and that we can measure. We can also do what's called secondary analysis. We can analyze the data that's already been collected by other people. So in other words, other researchers have done research on samples. If we take the information that's been collected by somebody else and perhaps apply it in a different way, run it through different analytical models, we are basically doing what we call secondary analysis. We can study documents. Our society obviously is a huge producer, collector, and retainer of information. So example I give a lot of times, if we wanted to include in our research something about the property values in a particular neighborhood, we could say, okay, could we find that information out by a survey? Sure, we could go door to door and asking people what their property's worth. You might think of that as a couple of different things. One, very labor intensive. Also, that you may not find that your information is completely valid. In other words, you knock on somebody's door and say, how much is your house worth? That person might feel the need to possibly inflate the value of their house to try to be impressive, or may not want to respond at all, again, questioning your motives. So we would find that doing a survey in that case, probably unreliable. So again, I ask students a lot of times, where would you find that information? And the most common answer is the courthouse. You would just go down to the Register of Deeds, the county surveyor, whoever else it is, and there would be all that information that you would need about property values in a particular area. So certainly we can look for documents that exist. You can conduct an experiment, which I will show you an example of in just a minute, where we actually again, not to draw a parallel between these, but almost in a sense kind of run human beings, quote unquote, through a maze to study their behavior. And then almost the last one, it's kind of a catch-all, maybe kind of an umbrella to the entire procedure, something we call unobtrusive methods. Sometimes when there's no other way to directly collect information, we do it in what may be considered, in some cases, maybe kind of a sneaky way. A famous example of this was a sociologist doing research in suburban neighborhoods, and one of the questions was whether or not the incidence of alcoholism among residents of the suburbs. Again, you could potentially do things, and I usually throw this out to students and ask, what would you do in that case? I get very imaginative answers. I would stake out the local bars or liquor stores, again, very labor intensive and perhaps not very easy to do. You would go and look up registration at things like AA meetings. Once again, you're running into some difficulty there with issues of confidentiality, people's privacy, those kind of issues. You could conduct a survey, go door to door and knock. Excuse me, are there any alcoholics who live in this house? Once again, you're probably not likely to get a lot of valid results from those kind of things. In the case, the example that we gave here, the sociologist in question went around on trash nights and looked in people's trash. Okay, and not on any given just one night. Obviously, the day after 4th of July would be a bad time to rely on this as a method of collecting information. But if you go every week for months, let's say even say years, and typically a household in the area that you're studying is always throwing away 5 or 6 whiskey bottles a week, you may have a person at that location who has a problem with alcohol. So there are definitely ways of collecting information other than some of the other ones we talked about. Okay, I'm going to take a second to clear the board, and then we'll come back and I will show you how to conduct a sociological experiment.